Shalom semuanya, apa kabar? Jumpa lagi bersama saya Romeo Dirk Junior di channel yang spesial menyajikan video-video apologet Kristen dan video-video kesaksian Kristen yang berasal dari sumber-sumber data yang terpercaya dan valid. Video ini bertujuan hanya ingin mengedukasi penonton tentang apa yang dibahas sesuai judul video.
What does it mean to be unreliable?
Muslims believe in Jesus Christ. There's a lot of interest, I think, from the Muslim community, and many Muslims feel that your conclusions, your historical conclusions of who Jesus Christ is more commensurate with the Muslim idea than it is with the Christian one.
I wouldn't say that they line up well with the Muslim view. I really do think Jesus was crucified and that he really was dead and buried. I'm not interested in whether Jesus was the Son of God because I don't think there's a God. And so,
Oke, saya ucapkan selamat menonton. Semoga melalui video ini Anda mendapatkan sesuatu yang bermanfaat untuk menambah pengetahuan tentang banyak hal yang selama ini Anda belum ketahui. Terima kasih sudah mampir di channel saya. Kiranya Anda bahagia selalu bersama semua yang dicintai. God bless you. Bye.
My understanding is that your conclusion is that Jesus Christ was a messianic prophet.
I think he thought that he was a son of God in the sense that he was specially chosen by God. I think Jesus really did think he was going to be the Messiah, the future king of Israel. I mean, that is, after all, why they crucified him. I think that that's historically right. You know, I think that all of these gospel authors, I think all of them think that in some sense, Jesus is God. If you think that the Bible cannot have any mistakes in it, if you're shown a mistake, then you just refuse to admit it's a mistake. You think either it can be reconciled in some way or that there's something we just don't understand about it, or, you know, we have, and
In the Quran, it's mentioned if this book was from other than God, they would have found in it many contradictions.
if a book is without contradictions, that has no bearing on whether it comes from God or not. I've had phone books that are inerrant, but I certainly don't think God gave them. So, no, that is my view.
It's a necessary condition for a book from God not to have contradictions.
That's an assumption about what kind of book God could write. I know this is an important argument that apologists use for Islam. As somebody who is not either Christian or Muslim, it doesn't make sense to me for humans to say what God has to do. If God wants to make a revelation, it has to be this, this, or that. You're talking about somebody who's beyond your imagination.
There has to be something within revelation which distinguishes it from human speech so as to act as an evidence.
Yes, I know that's your argument. I'm saying who says it has to be? You are.
No, yeah,
exactly right.
If it's not, then anyone can claim prophecy or prophethood, right?
Well, the Christians say that's what the Christians say what Muslims are doing. They're just claiming things for themselves.
No, in the past, prophets came with kind of visual miracles. The final prophet, who's we believe Prophet Muhammad, he came with something that can be analyzable in our times. If it's analyzable in a sense that you can distinguish it from human speech, and so this would be the argument that we would put forward.
Yeah, no, I know, and I don't buy it.
No.
Suppose he did not call himself God. That would not mean he's not God. I don't call myself a pain in the neck, but doesn't mean I'm not a pain in the neck.
No, maybe.
And I don't buy it.
What do you think about that? How much do you think your findings and ideas are in alignment with Islamic understandings of Jesus and Christianity?
So this is kind of a humorous side of this that you probably don't know, which is that the two groups that most missionaries and apologists who most like to use me are Muslims and Mormons. Go figure. I think both groups are interested in showing that their own scriptures are important, and in the case of Muslim apologists, the idea is that the Quran doesn't have any of these problems, and therefore Islam is a superior religion. I'll tell you where I would agree. when it comes to the New Testament Gospels and the entire New Testament, we have many thousands of copies, and they do have lots and lots of differences among them. Hundreds of thousands of differences among our copies of the New Testament, but most of those differences are completely insignificant. Like, they don't matter for anything. We're counting like misspelled words and things like that. So they don't. But some of them do matter. They affect how you might understand a passage or a book or the entire New Testament. And the Quran's just not like that. Obviously, I mean, the Quran has been faithfully copied for many, many centuries. So that part is absolutely right. That, in my opinion, does not make Quran a superior book. It means it's a better copied book. It is possible to make many, many copies of a book without making any mistakes, and it has no bearing on whether the book is true or not.
Yeah.
I mean, the example that I use with my Christian audiences usually is that, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf is in millions of copies without a single letter different among them. There's no bearing on whether you want to believe it or not. Which is, he got copied well.
Yeah, if the original idea, if the original text is flawed, then it doesn't really matter how much it has been preserved. The end result would also be flawed, right?
You do have a better idea what the author said with the Quran, because in some places of the New Testament there are debates, but it doesn't mean that what he said is true. And so that's a whole different question. And you can't really use me to show that Islam is truer than Christianity, because I don't.
What about the idea that so in Islam there is this whole understanding that Jesus was merely a prophet sent by Allah or God, and he merely came to deliver a book called the Gospel. Now, this is very foggy. It's very hard to understand and to debate what exactly is being said. But the Quran refers to the book of the Gospel that was given to Jesus, that was sent by Jesus. According to our understanding and according to your findings, is it plausible to say that Jesus was indeed on a mission to deliver a certain scripture, a certain book to his disciples, and that got completely lost without any traces?
No, I'd say that's completely implausible, and I don't think that's right historically. Jesus didn't hand his disciples a book. Jesus didn't have a book. My view is that Jesus certainly couldn't write himself. He was. And I don't know if he could read. It's interesting. There's only one passage in the New Testament where Jesus is said to be able to read, and it's a later passage. And so I don't know. He was raised. I'm talking about the historical Jesus now, the actual man Jesus. He was raised in a very small little place called Nazareth, which we're not sure how large it was, but they've dug it up, and it was a small place. There were no public buildings, just kind of really very bare housing, stones put together basically with thatched roofs or whatever. But there were no schools or anything, and probably he didn't actually go to school. And so I don't know if he could read or not. But the idea that he had a book of any kind and then passed it on is implausible, and it's nowhere in our early sources that says that. So I don't think that's what's going on. The Gospels that we have are written 30 or 40 or 50 years later. And so there's nothing to suggest that his disciples couldn't read, by the way. I mean, two of them, Peter and John, are actually said in the New Testament to be illiterate. Acts chapter 4, verse 13, they're agrammatoi, they can't read. So I don't think he was passing on books to them.
And could it be said that the earliest Christian accounts about Jesus, that the Gospels and the Epistles are very much accurate about Jesus and about the words that he spoke? Or could it be argued that there is a huge, vast corruption of what he actually was and what he actually said?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a corruption. What I would say is that Jesus taught his disciples, and he did things that they saw, and when he died, they told stories about them, and these stories passed along in oral circulation for a long time, for 20, 30, 40 years, before people started writing them down. We know a good deal about what happens to stories in oral traditions, even in cultures that are not literary, even in oral cultures. Stories change, and when a storyteller will change a story in order to make a point, or to in light of his audience, or for all sorts of reasons, and stories get made up. And so there are stories in the Gospels that are almost certainly made up. I'll be dealing with this in my webinar on the birth stories in the New Testament, because the stories of Jesus' birth are found in only 2 of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Mark and John don't say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin in Bethlehem or anything like that. But the 2 accounts we have are much later. They're probably dated 50 or 60 years after his birth. And so, oh, no, more like 80 or 85 years after his birth. And they have differences between them, and some of them are not plausible historically. And I think that's true of the Gospels as a whole. There is accurate information in the Gospels, I think. There's historical information in the Gospels, but what scholars have to do is to figure out what's historical and what's legendary.
What about certain sources like the Proto-Evangelium of James, for example, certain extra biblical or apocryphal sources that were not included, in the New Testament, which tell us certain things, such as that Jesus brought, certain stones to rock birds to life, or that he spoke as a child, and things like that. What can you say about them, about their authenticity?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to be talking about the Proto-Evangelium during the talk. The term Proto-Evangelium just means it means the gospel before the gospel, because it's the proto-gospel before the gospel, because most of the proto-gospel of James is about the miraculous birth and upbringing of his mother Mary. Mm-hmm. And what's driving the account is the question of why her? Why would she be chosen? What was so special about her? And the account tries to explain that. But then it gives a very remarkable account of Jesus' birth and what happens afterwards. This is almost entirely a legendary account. It dates from the 2nd Christian century after the New Testament Gospels, but it was heavily influential on Christian thinking throughout the Middle Ages about Jesus' birth, including, I don't know if you've seen much Christian art from the Middle Ages or in the like in the Renaissance, but whenever they show a picture of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, right, at the birth scene, Joseph's always an old man. Mm-hmm. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Proto-Gospel of James, the Proto-Evangelium. And so there's lots of really interesting stuff, and there's very surprising stuff in there. But it's really more valuable for seeing what Christians were saying about Jesus' birth years later, 100 years later, than it is seeing what actually happened.
I see. I bring this up because you might be familiar with the fact that Islam adopts a lot of certain stories, like Jesus speaking as a little baby, yeah. Things like these that are found in some of these sources that are considered, fabrications. And
well, yeah, that's right. And the story about him making birds is actually in a different gospel. That's in the gospel that's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Mm-hmm. And he makes these 12 sparrows. And when he's accused of violating the Sabbath, he claps his hands and brings them to life, and they fly away. And so, like, he's destroyed all evidence of any misdoing. What do you mean? Sabbath? What birds?
That is interesting. In some of these sources, there are some very strange accounts of Jesus. I read some of the Gnostic Gospels, for example. Yeah. And things that he says and does are completely irreconcilable with the New Testament Jesus that we have.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's stories get told about famous people, and sometimes they're historical and sometimes they're not, and the task is to figure out which is which.
Mm-hmm. Next thing would be, how much can we be sure about the crucifixion of Jesus and whether he was indeed crucified?
Right. I know in Islam the teaching is that he was not actually crucified. I think on a historical basis, Jesus was absolutely crucified. I think that there is, as a historian, there's almost no doubt about that. And in case your audience doesn't know, I don't identify as a Christian. I mean, I was raised a Christian, but I'm an atheist now. I don't have a particular stake in any of this information personally. But I think the crucifixion of Jesus is probably one of the best attested events of his life. It's found all over the place in our early sources. It's even mentioned by non-Christian sources, and it's a kind of a complicated thing for me to argue. Although I can at length, if somebody wants me to, it's not the kind of thing that Christians would have made up about him if they wanted to make up legends. If they wanted to make up something about Jesus, it wouldn't be that he got killed by the enemy, tortured to death. What they would have made up is that he became the king and he's sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. But they couldn't make that up because everybody knew it wasn't true. And so they had to say, well, yeah, he got crucified. But then they ended up saying that because he was crucified, that was significant, that it was the plan of God. And but they're kind of explaining it. They're not, they're explaining because they got to explain it because he was crucified.
Yeah. The Islamic account is very strange. It is that I guess that people think Jesus was crucified and that somebody was crucified, but it wasn't Jesus. It was just somebody else who people thought was Jesus, and it's a very strange thing to think.
Well, it is, and it didn't start with Islam. It actually there's a Christian teacher in the 2nd century named Basilides who was an Gnostic. And he wrote a gospel. He wrote a Gnostic gospel. We don't have the gospel anymore, but we have a church father who talks about it. And in his account, what he says is that there was a fellow in the Gospels. Jesus is carrying his cross, and they impel somebody else to carry the cross for him to the place of crucifixion. And according to Basilides, what happened is this other person, whose name was Simon from Cyrene, which is in North Africa, Simon Cyrene carries the cross, and when he gets there, Jesus pulls an identity switch. He's the Son of God. He can do miracles. He makes Simon of Cyrene look just like him. And then he looks just like Simon of Cyrene. And so the Romans think they're crucifying Jesus, but they're crucifying Simon. And Jesus is standing by the cross laughing. Presumably Simon didn't think it was so funny because he's trying to help out here. So.
Understandably so. What about the I'm just shooting out a lot of questions here, I'm sorry, but when it comes to the gospel now, the problem is not only that that Islam doesn't accept the Gospels and the New Testament that we have. The idea is also not only that there was a book called the Gospel and that it was lost or corrupted, but also that basically the immediate followers of Jesus, that the early Christians were basically Muslims, meaning they didn't hold any of these heretical Christian ideas, and they were completely in alignment with the Islamic religion and the Islamic way of thinking, of simply regarding him as a prophet and worshiping Allah or God alone, and so on. What could you say about that?
So I would say that there are some elements of truth in that historically, and some things I think I would consider to be problems. But on the basic level, the idea that the earliest followers of Jesus thought that he was a human, and that he worshipped only one God, and they also worshipped only one God. I would say that that's true. That is true. I think that these earliest Christians, though, right after his death, believed that God had raised him from the dead and taken him up to heaven. And in the ancient views, whether it's Greek or Roman or Christian or Jewish, these ancient views, if somebody's taken up to heaven, they're living with God. They are made immortal, so they don't die again, unlike everyone else who dies again. An immortal is just another name for gods in ancient Greek. Jesus was made immortal, and I think that according to his followers, and so they started worshiping him. They didn't worship him as the one only God, but he was a being who deserved worship, and so they considered him to be the Lord whom they worshipped. And I think that happened early on. But they understood that during his life he was a human. Mm-hmm. They would not have agreed with most of the tenets of Islam that differ from Christianity, in my judgment. That I don't think is right historically.
Mm-hmm. But so the deification or turning Jesus into a god would then have begun due to the crucifixion and due to stories about the crucifixion within a lifetime of the crucifixion, basically.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I would say at the resurrection. I would say that what happened is, he got crucified. Lots of people were getting crucified, but the difference in his case is his followers came to think that he was raised from the dead. And it's not that he had a near-death experience. It's not that he died and came back for a while and then died again. In their view, he was raised. God raised him from the dead and took him up to heaven, and that was the deification. Mm-hmm. Later Christians then started saying, well, he didn't get deified at the resurrection. He'd been God from the time he was born, and so you start getting these ideas of the virgin birth. Then people say, well, actually, he was God before he was born, and so the developing understanding of Christ happens over time. But the earliest Christians, did not think he pre-existed, did not think he was born of a virgin. They thought he was a great teacher who was more righteous than anyone else that God had made into a divine being.
What about the idea of the Son of God? Did they understand him to be the Son of God, not only in the sense of, a great guy, but also in, in a spiritual, religious way, the way Christians later understood him? Was that something that was there from the beginning?
I think it was there from the beginning, but they meant something different by it. In Jewish circles, Son of God is used in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. Son of God is used for various beings. It can be used for angels, for example, but it can also be used for humans. The king of Israel was known as the Son of God. And the logic of it was that God has a kind of a representative on earth through whom he channels his will. And this person would be could be a human, but it was the one who's in a particularly close relationship with God, through whom God mediated his will. And so Jesus would have been seen as the Son of God in that sense. And he might have even talked about himself as the Son of God in that sense. Later, that came to mean that in some sense he himself was divine, that he was God. And that's the meaning that carried on later. But early on, I don't think they meant it that way.
Hey, it's me again. I know this is very interesting, but I want to remind everyone that the seminar is coming very soon. So please sign up now. bartdehrman.com/apostatechristmas. And now let's get back to the exciting part of the conversation. Is there any different gospel that is, in your opinion, or according to your findings, more authentic than the recognized gospels that we have within the New Testament?
No, I don't think so. I think that the four we have are the oldest ones that we have. There were some that had been written earlier that we don't have anymore, but these four are the four oldest. And the first three in particular, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a good deal of historical material in them. John also has some, but it's a very different kind of gospel. The later gospels tend to be, for one thing, they're much later, and they're more highly legendary. So I don't think that there are any other gospels that give us much historical information that's not already in the New Testament.
What about Paul, the authenticity of Paul's texts, some of which, as far as I understand it, precede the earliest gospel that we have?
Yeah.
How authentic are the accounts of Paul?
So the New Testament has 27 books altogether, and 13 of them claim to be written by Paul. So they're called the Pauline epistles. But of those 13, 6 of them are now doubted by scholars. Scholars think that 6 of them actually weren't written by Paul, but by people claiming to be Paul later. And I think that judgment is right. The other 7 are sometimes called the undisputed Pauline letters. They include many of the longest letters, and I think that they do go back to Paul. And in some places, Paul talks about things that Jesus said and did during his life. Paul says a lot about Jesus being crucified and being raised from the dead, and and so that's a lot of Paul. But he does occasionally mention something Jesus said or did, and that is older information than we get in the Gospels, because these letters were written before the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. It was your idea. We talked about this briefly before, but that the gospel in its original setting and according to the ideas of the earliest followers of Jesus would not be in alignment with the Islamic understanding of religion, right? I mean,
to some extent it is. I mean, they believe that there's one God, and that he has prophets, and that the Old Testament's a sacred book, and the New Testament's important. But the earliest Christians, they didn't have a New Testament, obviously, but they would not have subscribed to many of the teachings of Islam, because the teachings hadn't been invented yet. It was hundreds of years later that they came into being.
And were the Christians throughout the history of Christianity over the next 7 centuries, especially, vastly consistent with mainline Christian ideas, such as that Jesus is somehow the Son of God, that he's somehow divine, and all these things. That this was a dominant, a vast idea among Christians, right?
So a lot of my books deal with this issue, and one of the things that I argue at length is that in the earliest centuries, in say the 2nd century, the 3rd century, so I'm talking like 100, 200 years after Jesus, there was a lot of diversity within early Christianity. There were various groups of people who claimed to be followers of Jesus that had different books from the ones that got into the New Testament. They claimed these books were written by apostles, and they supported views that there were lots of controversial views floating around. There are Christians who said that there are 2 separate gods. Some Christians said there are 12 gods. Some said there were 36 gods. Some people said Jesus wasn't really a human being, but he was fully God. Others said he's human, but he wasn't God. So there are all sorts of views about all sorts of things in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Most of those views got hammered out by the beginning of the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine had become a Christian. And from the 4th century to the 7th century, there's still lots of diversity, but the diversity has to do with things that most people would consider to be more minor. There were big debates, like really going at it debates. But, you know, they agree, everybody agreed, Jesus is God, he was also human, there's a Trinity, they agree with these basic things.
Yeah, they very much just disagreed on how to explain these things together, and had big.
Well, if Jesus is God and he's man, how does it work? Is he 50% of each? Is he 100% of each? The view that came out, by the way, is that he's 100% God and 100% man at the same time. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, I have just 2 more questions. One of them is the idea that Jesus was merely a prophet who came in his time and who just spread a message of prophesying or informing the people about the coming of a more significant guy like Muhammad in the future. Is this a plausible idea?
It's plausible up until the time that you say that he's predicting somebody yet to come. I think that Jesus thought that he was the last. I think he was a prophet in the sense that he believed that he was speaking God's word. And I believe he thought he was the last prophet. I think he thought that he was the Messiah who was to come. And that in his view, I don't think Jesus expected to get crucified. I think just the opposite. I think Jesus expected God to send his kingdom to earth. And when the kingdom came to earth, he was going to make Jesus the Messiah. And Jesus would be the ruler of this future kingdom. So I have to argue. It takes a lot of argument to show that that's what was going on, but I do that in a couple of my books. I definitely do not think that Jesus was predicting Muhammad or anyone else, that he thought that he was it.
So insofar, I would think that incorporating Jesus into Islam was a very big miscalculation on the Islamic part. But
I wouldn't say miscalculation; it worked rather well. So that's fine, but I don't think that it's historically accurate.
Yeah, okay, that's sufficient. Finally, what do you think about the comparison between Muhammad as a figure? I don't know how much you are familiar, but Muhammad as a religious historical figure and Jesus as a historical figure. Do you think they are similar, comparable, different? What is your view on this in general?
In terms of their messages, you mean, or in terms of whether they historically or who we think they were, or what?
In terms of their messages, and as far as we have information on them, on how they were.
Well, I'm not a scholar of Islam, and so I'm not really equipped to say whether the sources on Muhammad can be considered reliable from a critical point of view. Of course, they are from a Muslim religious point of view. They're completely reliable. And that can be said about Jesus too. From a conservative Christian point of view, the information about Jesus is completely reliable. What would a hardcore historian who doesn't have any religious commitment one or the other say about Muhammad? The way I understand it is that there are controversies among historians about how accurate our sources are about Muhammad, but I'm not equipped to give you the details. With Jesus, I'm equipped to give you the details that we do have historical information, but a lot of legendary material as well. In terms of their messages, I think it's really important to understand that Jesus and Muhammad are living in very different times and places. They have different assumptions about the world, different presuppositions. Jesus is a first century apocalyptic Jew. And so, you know, he has a very different message from anybody living, you know, hundreds of years later. I think, whatever the person's religion, including Christians living hundreds of years later. I mean, Christians contemporary with Muhammad have a very different view of Jesus from the one that historians today would have.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bart Ehrman. I appreciate that very much. I hope I didn't bother you with my outlandish questions that are so unfamiliar to what you are normally doing.
Well, no, I've interviewed with Muslims and ex-Muslims before,